and welcome to Trip the Beltway Fantastic. I have the honor this week to welcome Ian Proud to the show. Ian Proud was a member of His Britannic Majesty's diplomatic service from 1999 to 2023. He served as the Economic Counsellor at the British Embassy in Moscow from July 2014 to February 2019. Prior to Moscow, he organized the 2013 GA Summit in Northern Ireland, working out of 10 Downing Street. He recently published his memoir, A Misfit in Moscow, How British Diplomacy in Russia Failed, 2014 to 2019. Jeff Roberts, an Irish professor and writer, wrote recently that, quote, Ian Proud is a very welcome addition to the ranks of Western ambassadors such as Jack Matlock and Chas Freeman in the United States, Britain's Tony Brenton and Tony Kevin in Australia. Why? Because they are, quote, dissonant voices that are needed more than ever amid fevered lobbying for yet further escalation of the Ukraine conflict. He called Proud a self-professed realist and quoted Proud from Misfit in Moscow, saying it's utmost folly attempting to resolve disputes with Russia through isolation and cancellation. And I am so happy to have Proud added to the ranks, to use Jeff Roberts' words, of writers who are using their experience and institutional wisdom to challenge the conventional narratives of the Western Ukraine-Russia conflict. Thank you so much, Ian, for joining me today on Trip the Beltway. Fantastic.
Thanks, Kelly. It's really nice to meet you, or virtually in person.
Yeah, and thank you. And I must add that you've been writing some great stuff for Responsible Statecraft. We'll be adding in the show notes your newest piece, which is going to be going up overnight. And that is when this show is broadcast on September 13th. So we'll preview that here. I wanted to ask you, I had another question teed up, but the big news today in the world of foreign policy and the Ukraine conflict is this ongoing pressure on the Biden administration to release, or at least approve Ukraine to use U.S. weapons for longer range attacks in Russian territory. And there's been a lot of talk about this. And I think the Brits have already decided to allow Ukraine this capability. Can you talk about what the impact of using these long range weapons to attack? We've already heard the Russian Kremlin spokesman overnight said something to the effect that there will be serious repercussions. We've crossed red lines before. This seems like a big one.
It's a very big one, although it's not a new one. I mean, Lord Cameron, the previous Foreign Secretary before the elections, also said the same thing, that we'd let Ukraine use Storm Shadow missiles to strike deep into Russian territory. That didn't happen. Lamy made some comments in Kyiv on September the 11th. I don't think a final decision has been taken. I think Biden and Starmer are due to kind of discuss it tomorrow. Let's see. I mean, I personally think it's a bad idea. The battle is happening in Ukraine. You're right, it's not actually happening in Russia. And what Zelensky has said is that he wants to make Russians fear war more than they fear Putin. And what that means is the potential for Western weapons to cause collateral damage in Russia. And for Russia, that's a massive red line. That essentially means that if Western weapons are killing Russian civilians, albeit through kind of Ukrainian strikes, then they will consider that the Western powers are an active player in the war, and that would give them a cause to kind of escalate further. And the thing is about Russians, from my time living in Russia, up close and personal, often in quite tense, as you can imagine, situations as there for the Salisbury Nerve Agent attack, is that they're always reciprocal. They always reciprocate in kind, albeit in an asymmetric kind, if that's what they have to do. But there would be a response. So I think actually, in fact, I think both Biden and Starmer will be much more cautious. Obviously, with Blinken and Lamy in Kiev together, they were saying all the right things. Let's see whether that turns into kind of reality. I have big question marks about it, frankly. Not least as which, from the US perspective as well, you've got an election on the horizon. Lloyd Austin just said last week in Ramstein that actually no single weapon is going to really make the big difference for Ukraine. So there's a big step from Austin saying that to Blinken saying what he said in Kyiv. I'm not convinced that Biden's going to take the gamble, frankly. I think it'd be too risky with Kamala Harris seeming to be coming up on the inside of Donald Trump in the final furlong. So let's see.
Yeah, that's right. Now, if I'm listening to this, I might say, okay, Russia, I guess, has responded in kind at the Ukrainians, but we haven't really seen a super big response in terms of reciprocation against NATO or Western powers that have delivered increasingly long range and lethal, more sophisticated weapons to Ukraine. There seems to have been a number of quote unquote red lines that Putin has not seriously responded to in regards to us, meaning the Western powers. Do you think this might be any different if this particular line is crossed, and why?
Well, the red lines have been smudged slightly. They haven't been kind of decisively kind of crossed. The Western powers have never yet given Ukraine weapons free. There's some blurring around the edges around kind of US and UK and French advisors operating in Ukraine, training them how to, giving them advice on targeting, and that sort of thing. But actual kind of Western missiles killing actual Russian civilians, that is a red line that I don't think has been crossed yet. There was that incident in Crimea a couple of months ago when the debris from a Western missile kind of fell on a beach near Sevastopol, and that actually killed some civilians, and that caused a direct conversation between Belarusov, the Russian defense minister, and Lloyd Austin, which then saw a slight retrenchment from the US and the UK side. That's kind of shot across the bows on the back of that incident. I think the Russians were prepared to kind of deal with it diplomatically because it wasn't a direct strike, it's collateral kind of strike. But yeah, I mean, I think that this is a big leap forward, actually, kind of potentially letting Zelensky target Moscow with a Storm Shadow is, quite frankly, frightening. Although I don't actually think they'd reach that far. Maybe Rostov-on-Don, but you see what I mean.
I mean, I think I know the answer to this, but I would assume that Moscow has the reach to hit Kyiv if he so wanted in retaliation if a missile were to strike in the heart of Moscow.
Well, he does now. I mean, he does now, of course. I mean, the Russians can strike as far as Lviv, which is right on the border, close to the border with Poland. So the question is whether they strike inside of a NATO country,
right?
Whether they strike kind of the weapon supply depots in, on the Polish side of the border, for example, whether they kind of strikes of US or other NATO troops, in Estonia or somewhere like that, or actually whether they kind of strike known Western military advisors that are in Ukraine, that actually leads to a loss of life of our people, British, American, French, other kind of service personnel. So, but actually, what other asymmetric things can they do that isn't actually militarily, shutting down a sort of an airline kind of checking in system for a day or that sort of thing, the normal kind of fun and games that you see from time to time when there are these massive cyber attacks which kind of close down a big part of global sort of movement and business, that sort of thing. So there are lots of options at their disposal. Let's see. But I mean, I'm yet to be convinced that actually that Biden or Starmer really have the stomach to kind of take that big step forward, not least as actually Ukraine seems to be losing on the battlefield, right? I mean, what is there to gain from, we're not going to win the battle for Kiev, but the best way to kind of halt their losses would be to negotiate.
Right. Well, absolutely. Well, I do want to talk about that a little, but before we do, let's discuss the current situation in Kursk, because in early August, it looks like, it sounded like, by all Western reports, that Ukraine was successfully pushing in. They had at one point boasted of having, I think, 1,000 square miles under their control, control being somewhat fungible, hundreds of Russian POWs. This seemed like a big PR win for Zelensky, but you, writing for Responsible Statecraft, will have your piece in the show notes, as well as Anatol Levin at the Quincy Institute, John Mearsheimer, and others had cautioned that perhaps Ukraine didn't have the resources and manpower to actually solidify these gains and make them work for them. If anything, it might be a trap. And I was wondering now, this is September 12th today that we're recording. How do you feel about the Kursk incursion and what impact it might be having on the war today?
Well, there are two things I'd say about it. Firstly, going back to August itself, it was a big embarrassment to Russia, very clearly, and Ukrainian forces walked into it quite easily. But they walked into a fairly underpopulated part of Russia that's a fairly low value agricultural kind of land. And if you look back in history, with Napoleon's invasion, with the Nazis' invasion in the Second World War, the Russians have just traded them that space for a short period of time, for longer term strategic reasons, and carried on with their main advance in Donbass, which continues at a pace and so on, and that that continues to kind of to grind forward and make small gains every single day. The difference between Kursk and Donbass is that in the Donbass, you've got, according to some estimates, trillions of dollars, according to Lindsey Graham, of coal, of lithium, and of other kind of precious metals in the Donbass. So the Russians are basically fighting for, to take control of this enormous kind of wealth of mineral resources under the ground. The Ukrainians are occupying farmland in Kursk. So it's not exactly like for like, but if you bring it forward to the here and now, if you take that historical caveat that I presented a moment ago, the Russians have let them occupy that land for a while. In the past 2 days, there's been a massive counter attack in Kursk, where the Russians are coming in from the western flank, and in the space of just over a day, they'd already sort of taken back 11 settlements in quite a rapid strike, and there's also kind of scope, I think, there too. Let's see, to actually encircle and trap some Russian troops within Russia. If Russia managed to pull off an encirclement there, so the tide is quickly turning away from Ukraine. Its advantage in terms of land that it had gained this year over land that Russia had gained this year has now gone into the kind of the debit, frankly. And actually, I think within the next week, you'll probably see that the complete removal of Ukrainian forces from Russia on the back of this kind of this regrouping and counter strike. So that's what I think makes the both the timing of Lamy and Blinken's trip interesting, because actually Russia timed their counter-offensive for when Blinken and Lamy were in Kyiv. The Russians may kind of calculate it that way.
Oh boy.
And their promise of weapons, because actually the promise seems increasingly hollow now, because Ukraine is very obviously losing, and letting them fire storm shadows deeper into Russia isn't really going to advance.
So what is your assessment of why Zelensky did this? Was it purely like you had written, a roll of the dice? They were losing. They needed to solidify Western support, say, hey, look at what we can do. We just need a little bit more assistance in your long-range missiles, and we can really turn this thing around. Was there any other, it seems to me at this point in hindsight that it was a bad idea. Part of me is thinking, did they want to distract from what they were losing on the front lines in the East by staging, what seemed to be a critical turning point in the war, as to, like I said, distract from what was going on in the East, which obviously is not happening. What are your insights on what his motivations might have been in early August?
Well, Zelensky, I think more than anything, is keen to keep the West in the fight. He's keen to continue to receive weapons from the West. even though very objectively, he's not turning the tide. In fact, quite the opposite. He's losing. But by showing some sort of audacious conquest into Russia, that he would sort of keep that weapons kind of train flowing, and I think that's very much what was in it. There was an element of undermining the morale of Russian people, against Putin, that actually, particularly in a place like Kursk, which has historical significance because of its role in that massive tank battle in World War II, is quite an iconic place, for the Ukrainians to invade. That might undermine Russian morale and Russian support for Putin. This Zelensky idea that Russians should fear war more than they fear Putin, something Zelensky said in recent weeks. There's an element of that, but I don't think anyway that this kind of fairly small incursion compares anything like, frankly, what Prigozhin did last year, which was to take over Rostov-on-Don and drive a whole column of troops up as far as Voronezh. That is a far bigger scale of magnitude, frankly, in terms of the impact on the Russian psyche than this fairly small agricultural kind of invasion. So I don't think that's really worked. So it really comes back to this kind of desperate need to keep the West in the fight. And Zelensky keeps talking about sort of making peace, but actually whenever he talks about making peace, what he's really talking about is please give me more weapons to fight. Doesn't really seem to me interested in peace. The only thing that will happen if there's a ceasefire, which would precede any kind of peace negotiations, is that actually martial law would end in Ukraine and he'd have to face election. And that I think there's a fairly strong chance that that his political career would be over, and his acting career is obviously over now. He can't exactly go back to comedy after politics. So what does he do? So I think there's that very much in play as well. And I think he's so desperate now that he's just sacked half of his cabinet in the past few days. He's just literally clinging on to power, and we are indulging him in this fantasy that we can keep pouring billions and billions into Ukraine, can keep this war going, to the detriment of Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian state, the Ukrainian economy.
You mentioned how Zelensky has been peppering his talk with thoughts about a possible peace talks, negotiations. I've seen also and heard other Western voices that are starting to talk about talks and peace, including German Chancellor Olaf Scholz in the last, I believe, 3 or 4 days, had also talked about how at some point there must be a negotiation or a negotiated settlement. I don't have his exact words with me, but you could say that he is reacting to the realities, the political realities in Germany right now. You have the far left and far right parties ascendant, and they are being fueled by an increasing anti-war sentiment, as well as reacting to the economy, which is in many ways tied to the sanctions and other impacts of the Ukraine war. You're seeing this in France as well. So what is your sense in Europe in terms of any political shift towards negotiations and away from this, we are backing you at all costs, whatever it takes to win and get Russia out of your country?
Yeah, well, the thing anybody needs to understand about foreign policy is that it's always driven by domestic political considerations, right? It always is. You're always thinking about what's our national interest at stake here in compelling us to act in this particular foreign theatre of activity. And to the extent to which people like Boris Johnson at the start, Olaf Scholz, Macron, obviously Biden, were keen warmongers, to kind of really take the fight to Russia, which they have done for the past kind of 2.5 years. When it comes down to it, they're political beasts, right? And when the political tides turn in their countries, that will impact on their foreign policy thinking, and that's what we're seeing happening in Germany. That's what we've been seeing happening in other countries too. We don't see that happen in the UK because there's almost a complete media blackout of any kind of alternative view on the Russia war. What I find really heartening about following the debates in the US is that you have a debate.
Yeah.
You have the head banging, neocons, the Jake Sullivans, the kind of bonkers Dan Frees, Victoria Newlands, and people on that camp who just come what may will fight to the last Ukrainian. You have those people, but you have the Mearsheimer's, you have the Anatol Zhus, the people who take a much more considered and realistic view on the situation and have a debate. And you see that playing out in the presidential election.
Yes.
Where Kamala Harris, in the absence of any ideas of her own, is just following the status quo. Bequeathed by really Jake Sullivan, because Biden doesn't really function as a kind of a foreign policy kind of president anymore, and Trump, who says he'll end the war in 24 hours.
Yeah.
Remains to be seen. But the point is, from a domestic political, through a domestic political lens, there's choice, which in any democracy you need. Democracy is about choice. People who talk about populism. When was politics ever not about populism? It's about one policy being more popular than another. So that I find that heartening about the US, that you have a genuine debate, and I'm hopeful. Let's see anyway that after the elections, we see some change of course there, because it certainly won't be driven by the UK side. But Germany, the BSW, the AfD, the two kind of left wing, right wing kind of parties, they are very much sort of kicking and screaming, shifting Olaf Scholz in that direction. And that's just the truth of foreign policy. It always comes back to domestic politics.
So talking about Britain, do you feel somewhat lonely in your perspective? And what kind of response did you get when you published your book, A Misfit in Moscow? Because it is very critical of the diplomatic pathway that was taken in the teens, 2014 to 2019, leading up and amid the Crimean takeover and leading a Maidan revolution and leading up to the current war. Do you feel like you're sort of a lonely voice in the wilderness over there?
Yeah, very much. There are voices here, people like Jeff Roberts, Richard Sackwell, Tony Brenton, a former British ambassador to Russia. But we're few and far between over here. And the mainstream media, I believe there are some journalists who are of a more realistic, disposition on this, but they're afraid to kind of raise their journalistic voices, because all of the mainstream media companies are totally bought into this as well. It does feel a bit lonely. I have lost some friends, probably gained some friends as well, but that's life. But I think ultimately, as a diplomat, right, our job has to be to end wars, not start them. And whoever's
what a novel concept.
Whoever's most at fault, if Russia's most at fault or Ukraine's most at fault or we're most at fault, nobody's ever completely to blame when things go badly wrong. And the people that suffer are ordinary people, civilians, children dying there in Gaza, anywhere around the world. When children are dying, we should all be ashamed. And as diplomats, we should be trying to make these difficult conversations happen. Diplomacy is not an easy thing to do. You've got to have tough conversations, and diplomacy can't be refusing to talk to somebody that you don't like. Diplomacy can't be not talking to Putin because we just don't like his worldview. That's not how the world works. We have to kind of grow up and just have these tough conversations. It's far tougher to talk than to kind of throw bombs, let's be honest, really. And there's been a global kind of vacuum of statesmanship, I think, that has contributed to this terrible situation we have, not just in Ukraine, but in Israel, Gaza, where, I have sympathies as a Christian, have sympathies on both sides, from the Jewish side, on the kind of Muslim side. Innocent people are dying every day. It's just like, why are we not trying to stop this?
Right.
Rather than, and what I see, particularly from the Biden administration, particularly from actually both the previous Conservative and now the current Labour Party government in the UK, is actually diplomacy where we have to take sides.
Yeah.
The Ukraine crisis is all about us backing Ukraine. It's not really about us trying to kind of find a resolution of the differences between Ukraine and Russia. We are backing Ukraine. And if you look at Israel and Gaza, that is really about us ultimately backing Israel, over people in Palestine. I'm not taking a view on either side of that conflict, let's be clear. But actually, the point is, diplomacy should be about bringing people together in dialogue, however tough that dialogue is, and that's what's missing.
I don't know when at what point in your career that you fully entered into the diplomatic path professionally, but has it gotten worse in terms of this idea that we cannot talk to our adversaries, that somehow that they're evil, and therefore out of the realm of negotiating with or talking to, and I specifically point to Kamala Harris's performance in the debate, and I don't know how closely you watched it, but she made a big point, and she's done this before, and as did Biden, that Trump likes to talk to dictators, and they point out Kim Jong-un and North Korea, Putin, Xi Jinping, you name it, the axis of evil, so to speak. And I just don't remember that growing up, that seemed to be such a major point, that we have raised up our adversaries to be the modern equivalent of Hitler, and therefore not to be spoken to. And anybody who does or attempts to is somehow a defender of or sympathetic to that evil.
Yeah, I mean, I've personally seen it very much unfold in the past, I'd say 11 to 12 years, really since, 2012, 2013, when the kind of the Maidan situation was just starting to kind of bubble up at the end of kind of 2013. But before that, even during the sort of Arab Spring, which was a bit of a disaster, frankly, from NATO's point of view, there were, the UK still saw itself as a convening power, bringing people together. That really changed in 2013, and actually, it's to our detriment that it has, because Xi Jinping is whatever political system they have in place in the People's Republic of China, he's in charge and probably going to be in charge for quite a long time to come. By all accounts. And just arming Taiwan is probably not the only sort of strategy we should be pursuing there if you want to kind of have enduring peace in the South China Sea, for example. Having sort of grown-up conversations about trade and all this battles over EV and all the stuff that's going on there, what's happening with the Uyghurs, and all these, we can't, countries are the way they are. And actually, the other problem is that we have to deal with that, particularly as China is now the second largest economy in the world, and at some point will overtake the US over the coming century, if it continues. But we pick and choose as well. Like, we have, or the US, the UK have had this historically kind of strong relationship with Saudi Arabia, which I think is a good thing. I'm not criticizing that in any way. I'm a diplomat. But if you look at human rights records historically, many would say, well, actually, how is that even ethical that we can have this, or indeed with Uzbekistan during the war on terror in Afghanistan, where the president of Uzbekistan was sanctioning the boiling of dissidents, for example. But because it was a transit route for kind of NATO weapons, traveling through Russia as well, by the way, incidentally, to supplies of NATO troops in Afghanistan, we turned a blind eye to that. So this kind of cherry picking on values is a problem for us too, because we lecture Putin and we lecture Xi Jinping, and yet we kind of turn a blind eye to atrocities elsewhere because it suits us to do so. And I think that really makes us look, it really erodes our credibility on the world stage at a time when China and Russia is shaping an alternative format of dialogue for countries in the global south. This BRICS thing, which is just in the past 2 years has taken off. Yeah, it really has. It's remarkable seeing rapprochement between Saudi and Iran, for example. If that happens, that would be quite remarkable. We're being left behind in this global conversation.
Absolutely. I mean, as the hypocrisy level has gone up and people around the world are recognizing it because we're so connected informationally on social media and just it, telecommunications writ large, people are very much aware of these contradictions that you had mentioned, whether it's supporting Saudi Arabia and their crimes because it is politically convenient for us in the Middle East, or what's happening in Gaza, and where we support the charges of war crimes against Putin on one hand, but we say they don't matter, and any punishments that the UN might dole out regarding Israel's charges of war crimes in Gaza, they're voluntary, they're meaningless. People see this, and I'm speaking about the United States here at this point, and I agree where this credibility has plunged as in terms of the U.S. being some sort of leader of the rules-based order. This alternative reality, in terms of this multipolar reality, is catching fire, and you see alternative trade, economics, geopolitics happening very quickly, and in a way that I think is threatening to the West or Western powers like the United States. And there does seem to be a reckoning happening, and I think what's happening in Israel right now is accelerating that. And who knows what's going to happen? But I personally, watching the debate the other night and following U.S. politics so closely, I don't have much confidence that that any of these lessons are being taken seriously in Washington right now by anyone, and that's unfortunate. Of course, there are voices like me and you and the others that you mentioned that are working tirelessly to get the word out, like, we need to change something here, we're going down. But I guess it's just going to take a lot more work, and obviously more writing from you. And I know we've run out of time, but I'd love to have you back on the show and absolutely, endorse anybody watching this to run out and get a Misfit in Moscow. And I hope it's successful for you there in Britain and here as well.
Thanks so much, Kelly. It's been absolutely lovely to meet you finally and talk as well. Look forward to talking again.
Yes, and I hope you make it here across the pond to Washington at some point as well.
Beautiful city. I hope so too.